Welcome to Meadowlarkers 70. It's a senior citizen edition of Meadowlarkers. It's just the two of us today. I am Howard Bryant. I'm with Kate Fagan. Amin El Hassan is out doing whatever it is that Amin does when he is not with us. And today we are talking about books. We are talking about one book in particular. We're talking about Kate Fagan's new book, whose birthday was yesterday, Hoop Muses, which I saw in a photo in Naples, Florida, in a bookstore. So you're big in Naples as well. I'm loving that. And my laptop is not yet. Oh, my iPad's not open. What is the subtitle, Kate?
Yeah, it's called An Insider's Guide to Pop Culture and, in parentheses, the women's game. And that parentheses is important, Howard, if you want me to share why it's important.
I do, of course.
Well, I didn't want to qualify the book at all. I thought Hoop Muses did the gendered work we needed done on the story of this book, but as marketing and PR goes, they felt like we really needed to qualify it. And I was like, okay, let's meet halfway. I will
And
put it in
by qualify, you mean to let everyone know that this book is about women's basketball.
Yes. It's not like Shea Serrano's book was called Men's Basketball and Other Things. It was just basketball and other things. So I wanted to at least push back a little bit on that. And the happy medium that we reached was I could put it in parentheses, which was my way of saying we are on our way to this vestige to get rid of this artifact that we have to always qualify basketball as girls basketball and women's basketball, and that they're forced to do that. Because what was interesting to me about that, Howard, was that, of course, I like that language does work, but because of the history of how we've treated women's basketball, it almost sometimes can come across as a pejorative, right? Like, oh, it's women's basketball or it's girls basketball. It felt like this way of dismissing the book
Not
before
real
opening
basketball.
It. Exactly. And that was what I wanted to try to avoid. So we ended with the women's being in parentheses.
It's a good compromise. It's a good compromise. It's absolutely, and it's a good concern. And part of the discussion that we're going to have. This is book number 3 for you, Kate?
4. I did one with a really small independent publisher, my first book. So this is my 3rd with like the publisher I'm currently at.
And which publisher is that?
Hachette. This one is
with Hachette.
Yeah, this one is with 12, which they have a really cool model that they only do one book a month so that they can actually give the book the attention it deserves. And then the others I did were with Little Brown. Who are your books with?
Oh, they're all over the place. I am currently under contract with HarperCollins. And then, of course, the kids' books, the middle grade books, and the children's books were Penguin, Random House. Cool. And then so it bounces all over the place. And then, of course, the essay books were Beacon Press.
Yeah. Whoever will buy the book, right? You're like, got no allegiance. Who wants to put my book out?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I think that there are times that you want to have allegiance, but then you realize, what is allegiance anyway, right? All is fair in love and business. And I think that when you start to look at how the real magic of a book to me, and David Halberstam, great writer David Halberstam told me a long time ago that if you're really going to have loyalty to anybody these days, and this was in the early 2000s, you have to have loyalty to your editor. If you find an editor that you work with, that you work well with, that understands you, that understands the types of books that you do, that understands the sort of voice and your approach, then that's as good as gold. The money is going to be, what it's going to be.
Yeah.
But if you find an editor you like, you keep them.
Yeah, you definitely come to find that within the book world, like there's all kinds of, you've got, for our listeners, you've got your advance, the money you get in advance of writing it, which you have to earn back to ever see any royalties. And so you're totally right. If you have an editor who not only you work well with in the making of the book, but that they have the right levers to push within the publisher to get the right marketing, to get the attention, to help you get placement in places on the backside. Like all of that stuff tends to be part of the equation when you're like, who should I publish with? Because the biggest advance isn't always the best idea. Although I've found that it almost always is the best idea.
Exactly. Well, let us go into the nuts and bolts of this in a minute. But first, we want to do a couple of things, a few of our housekeeping things. Number one, of course, We have only one or two honorary captains today, Kate
Yeah, I was
Fagan.
gonna
Just
say.
one. It's number 70. I think, once again, we're still in offensive lineman territory, starting to move into the defensive lineman category. Obviously, number 70 would be one of the great purple people eaters, Jim Marshall, Minnesota Vikings. We'll go outside of football. George Contos was a pitcher for the San Francisco Giants, where you have the pitchers. It's the new trend these days, wearing spring training numbers as your main number. So he's number 70. So that is out of the way. But now that we move into this, we're going to have a conversation about books in general, books. And the first thing I want to ask you is, one, this is book 4 for you. The book is Hoop Muses. And why this book? Why now? What was the inspiration for it? And it is since mine is on the way, I didn't get a copy. It's on the way. And by the way, for all of you folks out there, when your friends write books, go buy a copy. You don't have to ask for free copies. Buy a copy. And it's animated as well, isn't it? Don't you have an illustrator?
Yeah,
okay, tell us about it.
Well, yeah, you would have a book, Howard, but you decided you were buying one. Otherwise, you would have had one of those
exactly. That
early
is right.
copies.
Represent, man, support.
Like so Hoop Muses is illustrated. It's really colorful. If you see it of the cover, it's like a turquoise. It's really vibrant. It's illustrated by Sophia Chang. And so Hoop Muses to me is like a culmination of both living the game of basketball and loving it, and then seeing the media world and the world that lives inside of basketball, that the basketball lives inside of, and spending decades basically banging my head against the wall, trying to get people to understand the joy and fun and stories that exist in the game, but realizing that instead of actually telling people that they should care, I needed to try a new approach. It just wasn't working. Saying you should care about this, you should care about this wasn't working. So instead I was like, what if instead of telling people they should care, I should just make a book with care that shows and represents everything that I think this game is, and hopefully puts it together in a way where instead of feeling like you're being told you should care about it, you actually want to care about it because you see how vibrant and colorful and joyful it is. So that was really part of the origin of this book, was like, and there's others too, like I wanted to tell the mythology, I wanted to tell the history that had been buried, and we can get into some of that, but and fill in these gaps, because the nostalgia and mythology of the men's game does so much work for why we love it.
Why did you choose the illustrated approach?
Because
actually, before I say that, let me ask you a better question. What were your choices when you said, okay, just take me through the creative process when you're thinking, okay, here's a book I want to do, here's the idea, and now how do I want to execute it?
It was always an illustrated approach. From like the fact that it was going to be illustrated was the founding idea of the book. And because I thought women and academics have done really in-depth books on the history of women's basketball. Like there's a seminal book called Shattering the Glass by two women who just Susan Shackelford, and they do amazing work, but it ends up being for a niche audience because it's one-dimensional, it's black and white, just through no fault of that. That's just how printed words on the page are. And that didn't find a wider audience. So I wanted to do something where I thought at the ground level, if society is not looking at these women in history as like full-fledged three-dimensional figures that men get to be, right? So Babe Ruth and Shoeless Joe Jackson and Satchel Paige in some regards, and it get to be people in history. Obviously there's other limitations we can get into, but a lot of times in women's sports, like it has seemed to be just sort of this historical black and white boring thing that never gets injected with life. And I was like, if I'm going to go back and tell you a story from 1896 intercollegiate basketball, I better be bringing something special to the table if I think average Joe or Jane in America is going to be able to want to pick this book up. And so from day one, I was like, it has to be illustrated and it
has to be in color. Yes.
So people can see the vibrancy of these women in a way you wouldn't be able to do if it was just words on paper.
How is it when you start to think? I will go into this when I think about books. Well, number one, I'll get to that in a second. Question number two, you've got an idea. It's clearly a passionate idea, and it's not a. I love the fact that when we look at illustration, when we see illustrated books, when we see sort of things that are that colorful, we immediately assume that they're fun and funny,
Mm-hmm.
and less serious. But
Mm-hmm.
this is a serious idea that is strategically choosing that approach.
Yes. And the amount of times I've had to try to explain that this is not a children's book,
Mm-hmm.
like everyone's like, oh, it's an illustrated book. Like, I'm going to read it to my child at bedtime. Well, it turns out you could read them Hoop Muses at bedtime. I mean, they're bite-sized stories if you want to do that, but the topics within it and the sort of overall goal we're going for is not children's literature. It is supposed to be a unique packaging of something that only in this unique packaging would you be willing, many people, some would be willing to consume anything, but most people wouldn't be willing to consume it unless it was in this really artistic packaging where if it's sitting on your table, it's a work of art and you may occasionally pick it up. So it was like that foundational principle. But if you go into the book, we're telling you stories that aren't kid stuff. I mean, we're talking about the very divisive history of the NCAA's ownership of women's sports. We're talking to you about the Native American teams who love the game of basketball, but often only got to play it in those early years when they were at white boarding schools learning the ways of the white man. And
When they were
but
being
these Native
assimilated.
Yes. And so there's the way that, and you know this because of baseball in particular, because I feel like baseball always gets tied with history. The way you can go back in women's basketball history, and it is so reflective of the time period, is also akin to the way we think of baseball. And, like whether it's the black barnstorming teams that women were a part of in the 1930s. And so the book itself looks like a kid would love it and we think they will love it, but like it should be stimulating too to a curious adult brain as well.
Yeah. How do you feel like when I go into a book project, I have what I refer to as my 5 steps of anxiety.
Okay, I
And
want to hear them.
yes, and let's go over each one of these with your book.
Okay.
Step one, do I have an idea?
Okay.
So when you decided, the very first thing that people always ask, when you're trying to think about this, okay, is it a book? Okay, you have an
Hmm.
idea, but is it a book? Is it going to sustain X number of words? Can it sustain X number of pages? Is it an article? Is it a lengthy magazine piece, or is it a book? When did you decide Hoop Muses was a book? Did you always know that this was going to be the format that you wanted to take?
Okay, I love that this is paired with anxiety because it is paired with anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Like so I have the idea, right? I'm like, well, what if I tried to tell this in an illustrated way, in a really fun illustrated way? And then, I call people around me and I run this by them. And most people are optimistic for you in the
Do they
beginning.
get it?
They don't quite get it until I send them like the comps. Like I actually have to go on Google, find my comps, send them because otherwise they're picturing what we just talked about. They're like, so it's a kid's book. Are you illustrating it? And I'm like, no, no, no. And so I have to send them the comps. But then the next stage of anxiety is, okay, this is definitely a book in terms of the medium of it because it's not a magazine article. But is there enough history? Is there enough accessible history? Is the anxiety that's all part of before I put a book proposal together? Let me just spend a couple days and actually see if the historians of history who rarely cared about what I want to write about created enough artifacts for me to actually write from. Right. And
Which
that must be something you think about a lot in what you do because you're like, well, what exists? Because I have to pull from something.
That leads us to step number 2 of anxiety. Step number 1 is, do I have a book? Step number
Yeah.
2 is, can I get it? Is
Yeah.
the material there? Do I have the chops to do it? Do I have what I need to do it? Do I have the access to do it? So when now you're thinking about the can I get
Mm-hmm.
this book step of anxiety, how are you navigating, all right, I've got this ambitious sweep. I want to go back
Yep.
into the 19th century. And how do I get it?
Yep. Well, the great thing about the premise of this book was that the anxiety around this step wasn't tied to somebody's yes or no for access, which so often in journalism is, like a previous book I did, What Made Maddie Run. It was completely, the linchpin of it was whether Maddie's family was going to give me access to be able to richly tell this story, which is its own journalistic process.
Mm-hmm.
With this book, it was much more, I didn't have to, there was no phone call to make. It was, if I put a very rough timeline together of what I want to hit, are there enough newspaper articles and is there enough like historical work that I can do it? Which to me, and I don't know where you sit in this camp, I would much rather spend time alone in a library going through history than be dependent on an athlete or something else to grant me access. I would rather have my solitude and whatever my brain can piece together than dependent on, even if it's really dynamic, an athlete's ability to give me access.
Well, 100%, because now, I mean, this is why a lot of people say I actually said this myself after I was done with the Ricky Henderson book. I said, I'm only writing about dead people from now on.
Yes.
I'm like, you know what?
Which is pretty much what I did in Hoop Muses.
I am only writing about dead people from now on. Have you ever had a book that you wanted to do, as we keep talking about step 2 of the anxiety, can I get the idea? Have you ever had a book that you wanted to do and then realized you just didn't have it? And yes. I bring this up because for me, after I finished my second book, I think right before I decided that I was going to do The Last Hero, the Henry Aaron biography, I really, really, really was researching a book on John Coltrane. I'm a huge jazz guy. Mm-hmm. I love John Coltrane. John Coltrane is one of the seminal figures in jazz, and also somebody that I just absolutely find fascinating as an artist, just the artist journey of John Coltrane. And so now I'm starting to research whether I can get this book. I'm doing this legwork. I realize, number one, I don't know how to read music. Number two, I am not a music journalist. Number three, there's another book out there on John Coltrane. It's a biography of John Coltrane by Lewis Porter that is just a mind blower. And I realized in looking at this, I can't beat this book. I don't have enough I'm a fan of John Coltrane. I don't have what it takes to really contribute something here. So I dropped the project. It was one of the first times, but I had to be honest with myself as well. I'm a fan of Coltrane, but I don't think if I went down this road, I didn't see it. So that book died right there at step number 2.
Yeah. No, that has happened to me a number of times. I wanted to do a book about a year ago it was sort of a financial thriller, but in the world of sports, about a very famous product whose designer got written out of the history. And I was like, and it was about a moment in history too. So it was not just, this like intellectual theft and this product that we all use now, but it was also a story of like why that was allowed to happen and the different, I really wanted to do this, but it was dependent on one key person. And I had a good relationship with this person, but they had just recently agreed to do a documentary. And so they were like, I can't give you any real access. And I was like, it was different than your realization that I couldn't do it, but it was still like, I can't do a write around on this. It is completely dependent on this person being willing to be some level of partner on the telling of this story.
That's right. Step number 3 of anxiety.
Okay.
I believe, Kate Fagan, I believe that everybody either feels it or actually everybody has it. I think everybody has a story inside of them. And I think most people, whenever I do book events, when I have to go to readings and everything, I spend so much more time often talking about the process of book writing than I do about the actual book that I'm promoting. And that's because so many people are fascinated by the process of doing books. They all have a story inside of them. How many times have we all heard, I've got a book right inside of me, just can't get it out? How many times have we heard all of that? So step number 3, for me, step number 1 is, do I have an idea? Step number 2 is, can I get it? And step number 3 is, do the work. And what I found is that many, many people don't like step number 3 at all. They don't like step number 3 at all. I had a friend of mine once say to me, I would like to have written a book, but I don't want to write a book. And for all of you listeners out there, generally speaking, an average book is about 80,000 words. And at least on the nonfiction side, they can be smaller, longer, whatever. But generally about, if you have an idea, you have to pretty much figure it's got to sustain around 80,000 words. And I realized something about myself a long time ago, and I really lean into it now. I like to research. I really like going into the library. I like microfilm. I like, hopping on newspapers.com and going back and looking and finding, and there's a lot in it. It's a lot of legwork to just sit with material.
Mm-hmm.
How do you approach step number 30?
Okay, I was thinking about that because I know when just right there, that piece at the end, there's something so nourishing about going back in history in a way that I didn't quite understand until doing Hoop Muses, where I feel so like enlivened by understanding this particular history better. And it's so cliche, but it's my first real insight into how many modern answers I have about women's basketball have been the why has been answered for me in history. And I can be like, oh, do you want to know why that is? Well, actually, 1932, you do this all the time, Howard, on our show. You'll be like, well, this manager said this to me once, and it's revelatory of what's happening now. That history to me is something how much I loved it, I want to continue to live in going forward. I want to do more and more books that are immersed in history because it is so relevant outside of the book writing process. Okay,
isn't it really grounding? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, no. So just the last part of that was that it's something like 99% of people who start a book don't finish them. And that is the data. That is the data. And this is including everybody out there who's ever had a novel that they wrote the first 3,500 words to and then just stopped. I'll just offer a little bit of advice on this front, because one thing I have finally wrapped my mind around is that if you have to look at the first writing of whatever it is, the first draft of, like, it's a discovery. Like you're gonna have tons of mistakes. You can't get caught up in whether, like, that character that you thought was doing one thing, you're going to stop writing it because the whole idea is terrible. You have to get through the first draft and then discover what your story actually is. But everyone kind of, they die on the vine because they want some level of perfection as they're writing.
Well, and they also want some level of certainty. They want,
yes.
I can tell you, I have written 10 books. I am on book number 11 right now. And every single one of them, if you go back and look at the proposal that I sent to the publisher and what actually ended up between two covers, damn near night and day. It's an organic process. You have to go in and you have to discover it. You've got to go do the work, and you've got to realize that sometimes your premises aren't going to be correct, or sometimes there are going to be characters that pop up and make you feel like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't give this enough space and it needs more space. Or I had really emphasized this idea, but this idea isn't anywhere near as important as this one. When I worked on The Heritage that came out in 2018, that book was intended to be essentially a book of essays, which is what the next book, Full Dissidence, ended up being. And the reason why it didn't was because right when I started working on it, I realized that there was so much foundational history about protest in sports that people didn't know. I'm like, oh my God, this book is suddenly turning into a history book because people don't know this, and all of these different stories. When we talk about, say, Colin Kaepernick or Maya Moore or what's happening now, most times we ended up leaning on 2 or 3 examples. You lean on the 36 Olympics with Jesse Owens. You lean on Tommy Smith and John Carlos. You lean on, Billie Jean King. There's so much more. It goes back to what my good friend David Marinus, who we had on this show with his Jim Thorpe book, Path Lit by Lightning. He says it all the time. History writes people out of the story, and it's our job to write them back in. And when you go back into that history, you see all of the things that haven't survived. And then it's so invigorating to sort of bring them back. And the other thing I was going to say, too, about this, when you were talking about going into history, and especially probably in the women's game, is probably even, as pronounced as anything else. Doesn't it always hit you that we talk about this stuff? It wasn't that long ago.
I know.
Number of stories that were like, this sounds like today. This sounds like today. That person is still alive.
Yes. I mean, like even okay, perfect example of that is in Hoop Muses, it's curated by Simone Augustus, who, Olympic champion, WNBA champion. And in the book, I started to realize that like there was this woman who played and she was the best player of her era who nobody knows, called Nero White. And she played in the 1950s AAU era, which was very different than our current AAU structure. This was a structure where you could be a business and you could fund an AAU team. You could be a school and you could fund an AAU team, and your players didn't have to go to that school. You could play for 10 years for one of these teams. And there were teams like Nashville Business College, Tulsa Business College, as well as like Hanes, the underwear brand, had a very famous team. But there was one player, Nero White, who everyone said was like the best player no one had ever heard of. And it turns out that she played with Sue Gunter. And Sue Gunter is a legendary coach from LSU. And Simone had gone to LSU. And so all of a sudden, like you're saying, instantaneously, this black and white photo of Nero White, this player I'm like equating with, Naismith era, is
Hmm.
now just is now connected to me by the co-author of the book. And it just stuff like that makes you realize, and every moment I went back in history too, there were people saying things in 1930 that we're still saying today. you
That's
know
right. That is so right. Um, I also found in the doing the work in the step 3 stage,
yeah.
I found a real kinship with the material. And that is where when you talk about 99% of people not finishing books, if you want to take on a subject, how long did it take you to do this book?
From idea to publication,
Mhm.
almost 2 years, although
Two
the
years.
writing like a year.
So you're talking from conception to bookshelf. You're talking 2 years. You have to really be committed
Yeah.
to an idea to go through this process and all the ups and downs that come with the process. And that doesn't even include the business piece, which we're going to get into in a second. But
Yes.
you start talking about this and you realize, do I have the stamina? Does this idea have the legs for me to pay that much attention to it? There's a wonderful movie out right now called Turn Every Page. And it's all about the great biographer and historian Robert Caro and his editor, Random House editor, Robert Gottlieb, and their half-century relationship. Anyone, if you watch CNN or anybody who's got all their books behind them, Caro's first major book, The Power Broker, on Robert Moses, the architect of New York City. This book took him 7 years to do.
Yeah.
Then the next book that he's been working on, which is his trilogy of Lyndon Johnson, which is now no longer a trilogy, but now it's 5 volumes. He's been working on it for 54 years. And the 54 years, which is, by the way, I'm 54 years, it's my whole life. He's been working on
Yes.
this idea. And what's crazy about it is that the tension of the movie is that both Gottlieb and Caro are both in their 80s. They're in their mid 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And so the
Mm-hmm.
tension is, are we going to live to finish this last book?
Yes.
And so you want to talk about an actual life's work. It's
Yeah.
really incredible. And this is what I mean about having, it's not just having a passion, but just having the drive to see these projects through. And it's incredible when you're watching. I'm thinking about this, watching this movie, going, these two guys are literally on deadline.
Yeah, and it's a different kind of
It's a
deadline than you're
different kind of,
used
it's the
to.
ultimate deadline. They are literally on deadline. And the beauty of it is that there's scenes where Caro is talking about how, well, I'm not going to sort of shorten this section, or I'm not going to just gloss over this in order to finish the book. The book is going to take how much time it takes. And if I run out of time, then I run out of time. And I'm like, that is an artist right there. That is, that
Yeah.
is, that is being committed. Step 4 of the Howard Bryant steps of book anxiety is, did I pull it off?
Right.
And now you're done with the book. And as we start to move into the business side of the book and we move into the life side of the book, I always say that books have 3 stages of life. The first stage is the book is yours. It's you and your laptop and your materials and the library and your brain. It's yours. And this is the time for you to make it whatever it's going to be. This is when you're going to know how much effort you put into it. This is when you're going to determine if I did enough on this. Did I give it what it deserved? Because when you start getting into step two, stage two is the book then belongs to the publisher. And when the book goes to the publisher, then all of a sudden, you deal with the stuff you have to do that you dealt with. The publisher, by the way, ladies and gentlemen out there, the publisher has final say on cover art and title. We don't as authors. And sometimes sales and marketing is going to muscle you, and sometimes they'll give you your title, but it is their choice. When I did the Rickey Henderson book, the original title of that book was something like Rickey Henderson and the Legend of Oakland. And they wanted to take Oakland out of the title because they thought Oakland regionalized it way too much. So they made me take the word Oakland out of my title, even though this book is completely an Oakland story. And, that is then you have to deal with the author questionnaires, and you have to deal with legal. And all of a sudden you realize that this baby of yours, this book that you have birthed, is a widget to publishers. It's just another product that they are selling. And it's really, really hard and depressing at times. And then, of course, stage three is the book belongs to the world. And stage five. Exactly. Once you walk in, once you walk in to the bookstore and you see it on the shelf, on the one hand, it's got your name on it, but on the other hand, it's out of your control. It's not yours anymore. The public can buy it or not buy it. The public can love it. The public can trash it. The public can ignore it. The public can completely miss the point when you do interviews, and they'll talk about this book in ways that you say, well, that's not really what I intended. It's not yours anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of thoughts on that. Step 4. What I have always found interesting about step 4 is when the publisher all of a sudden then is weighing in. I have, in numerous books, not gotten the cover I wanted and not gotten the title I wanted.
And by the way, may I stop you right there, Kate Fagan? One of the tricks of the trade for publishers, because they don't want to debate with the author, they don't want communication with you, is they will send you a cover. I don't know if it's a first draft or 10th draft or whatever, but they'll send you a cover and okay, we have 48 hours to decide on if we like it or not. They don't even want you to say no. They're like, what they're really saying is, this is the cover.
Yep. Yeah. And I think what is hard in that stage is that throughout this very solitary journey that you've been on with your book, for the most part, unless you're somebody who is sharing chapter after chapter, you have your own vision of it.
That's right.
You have your own understanding. You feel like you know what you want to convey in a title, what you want to convey in a cover. And though your goals for it almost always directly clash with the publisher's goals for it.
Which is one of the reasons why you can't do what I have done on 2 occasions, which is write very heavily with the title in mind, writing to the title. And for my 9th book on Full Dissidence, Notes from an Uneven Playing Field, that book is really written to the title. That was the title. I had the title in mind, and I wrote that book to the title. And then we start getting to step 2 in the book life, and now the publisher owns the book, and now the book is in production. And they're like, well, let's change the title. And I'm like, no. And you had to fight them. I'm like, this. And on the one hand, they were pissed at me and I was pissed at them, but I was also like, okay, this is also a lesson to me not to be too wedded to the title, because that's where they have the most control.
Yeah. Like for example, in my book, What Made Maddie Run, I wrote that book under the working title of Filtered. And I wanted a more artistic, abstract cover because I didn't want the main athlete in the story, Madison Holleran. I didn't want the entire issue that I was trying to talk about in that book of mental health among young people, not just athletes, but young people and the forces that were at play. I didn't want Madison Holleran's face to be the only one, right? This was about a generation and a culture. It wasn't in my mind, even though Madison Holleran was the story that you went on. I didn't think that she had to be the face of it. And I also didn't want her name in the title of the book because I thought, again, Like filtered is this more abstract understanding of what is happening in our culture that affects mental health. And you can imagine, Howard, I mean, you've been through enough of these processes. The abstract does not work in the sale of a
No, it
book,
does
right?
not. Well, because let's face it, publishers are thinking about one thing when it comes to a book. Where does it go on the shelf?
Yep.
That's what they want to know. They want it to be as clean and they want it to be as direct. And they are not into your artistic musing about it whatsoever. It is cold, hard business. When I worked on my first book, which was about a history of race in the Red Sox, about the Red Sox racial history, they wanted to title it Fenway in Black and White. And I'm like, that sounds like a photo book.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
that's not what I want. And so my original title was Out at Home. It's a baseball title, and it was all about the Black players in Boston not feeling welcome in Boston. You know, this is their team, this is their city, and they're not essentially welcome as players. And the publisher was like, no, that sounds like it's a book about gay people. They're like,
Mm.
yeah, we can't. It's like, it's a gay
Yeah.
book. I'm like, it's a baseball term first before it was ever anything else. It's a baseball term. You're out at the plate. That's the, and they're like,
Yeah.
yeah. They're like, yeah, but we think the culture, I think if you asked 50 people if Out at Home made you think about coming out or if it made you think about sliding into home plate, most people are going to say culturally, they're going to make you think that it's about homosexuality.
Mm.
So no, new title. So we were at Loggerheads, man. We were fighting about this title and they were like, okay, well, let's just put it this way. You've got 10 days to come up with a title, or the book is going to be called Fenway in Black and White. In fact, to
Okay.
this day, the royalty statements for Shutout, A Story of Race and Baseball in Boston, still say Fenway in Black and White.
No, you have to be reminded of that every twice a year.
when I get my royalty check for $16,
Yeah.
it's it is a reminder of those battles.
So that's right. The royalty checks that everyone thinks are going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars and are
Huge
usually
dollars.
barely in the teens.
That's right.
Yeah, the worst and the best is when you have somebody within the publishing house who's actually seen if they made the iteration of your cover that you wanted, they mocked it up for you. They often won't send it to you, right?
No,
Like
they will not.
because they don't even want you to get fired up enough to fight for that thing you have now seen. But I've made friends with the people in my publishing house, so they'll often send me the version of my cover that I want, and then when I see it, I'm like, yes, I want that. I do, make it happen. And they're like, you weren't supposed to have seen this. So
That's not the one. That's not the one we
you
like.
can't
So you're
even
not going to see
email
that
about
one.
it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's go to step 5. The final step is
Oh,
what's next? Do you have, when you're done with the entire journey of the book, do you have that sort of seasonal thing that we get when you're covering baseball or when you're covering basketball, where the season's over, you're like, I never want to do that again. And then suddenly you start getting the itch for new ideas.
that usually happens in the weeks after a book comes out, mostly as a survival mechanism against the pain of publishing a book, because that is step 5 that you mentioned. Like, now the book belongs to the world, and this thing that you had ultimate control over, down to a comma most of the time,
Now you have no control over.
and now you and it's and even I've had books that have been successful, I've had books that have failed, and neither of them feel good, because you are at the mercy of this machine that is mostly based on timing, luck, who knows what, where, when, right?
And power. And let it be known out there, folks. Yeah. I'm very proud of myself for one thing, which is on the first book, obviously you just obsessed over your Amazon rank every 25 seconds. And it was like, can't do this. And then the second book, it was less. And now I've just reached a point where the work is the reward. These things are actually literally out of your control. You do not have, and you don't know what book is going to, like my Ricky Henderson book was, missed the New York Times bestseller list by 75 books or something like that. Yep. And who knows what forces kicked that book off the list, which ones got it on. That the public, did the publisher do enough for it? Do they have plans for you? They've got a certain number of resources. How many phone calls is your book going to be the one that gets the phone call, that gets pitched to GMA or gets pitched to the Today Show or
That's
gets
right.
pitched to the Daily Show or whatever? And if it's not, then you're not even in the running to get a chance to get a bestseller. Are you the, when your publisher is calling NPR and they've got 5 books that they want to pitch, is your book one of them? And so all of these different things go into that anxiety when you have to find a way to pull yourself out of that, even though it's very, very difficult, because you literally bled on the page to get this thing out and to get it done.
Yes. And so similarly to you, my first book that came out, I was just so intertwined with how it would do. And it was emotionally
and that's
wrenching.
rightfully, because the goal of a first book is to get a second book. You don't want to, if you bomb that first book, you don't know if there's going to be another opportunity. And also there's an arrogance that comes with book writing, and that you feel like you're writing about something that people need to know about. And then, of course, when you compare it, you say, okay, here I am working on something of value and I'm looking at all these, other books out there that are fluff or whatever. Like, why is that book getting more than this book? And you really do have to pull yourself away from that sort of, pettiness, and because it'll destroy you. And you're realizing that you're being controlled by the outside forces. The work itself has to be the reward.
It has to be. It has to be. And that's what I've reminded myself every single day with Hoop Muses, because I don't want to get caught again on we just missed GMA for Hoop Muses. They were considering us for the 8 a.m. hour, but that particular producer thought they did too much sports. So they were like, we're going to pass. It's like, I can't control that singular producer doesn't want to do sports this week.
That's right.
And so we miss our opportunity. So it's like those things you can't control. So like, I forget who said it, but you probably agree with this, is like the only antidote to publishing is writing.
Is writing.
Is writing.
I love that. That's true.
Because otherwise you will just bang your head against the wall.
Well, that's right. And then, of course, comes the other piece of it, which I try to explain to people, where people believe that, that exposure and wealth are the same thing. They are not the same thing. And I'm like, listen, do you really want to talk about the business of this? I got into an argument with Frank Robinson one day, where the late, great Hall of Famer, Frank Robinson, who refused an interview with me about Hank Aaron. And I went to Nationals Park, or RFK back then. And he was like, yeah, I'm not talking to you. Why do you get a chance? Why do you get to get rich off my name? Why do you get to make millions off of me? And I'm like, millions? Rich? I'm like, Frank, with all due respect, I'm like, look, man, let's do the math on this, okay?
Yeah.
I make 8% or 10%, and maybe, depending on the book, 15% off of every book. So if I sell one hardcover for $25, I make $2.50. Okay, here are the economics of book writing. We all go broke book writing. I just came back from the Tucson Festival of Books, and somebody asked me, I was with Jamel Hill, and one of Jamel's friends was like, okay, let's talk about the economy of book writing. And I said, marry up.
Yeah.
Marry somebody rich. I mean, make sure that your dollars aren't coming from this. I mean, unless you're Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or John Grisham, very, very few of us are making a full-time living off of doing this. We do this because we love it. We do it because the idea deserves it. I mean, now there are some books out there, if you hit and they make a movie out of it, or if you get, an Eat, Pray, Love or something, and you get one of those, all right, bet. But for the most part, your 99% of books that never get finished stat. I believe that, I remember a publisher once told me 95 or 97% of advances don't make their advance back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Don Van Natta, very early on, ESPN reporter, when I was putting out my first book, he tried to share some wisdom with me on the outset, and he was like, you have to look at that as like, you basically, instead of buying a lottery ticket, you wrote a lottery ticket for yourself.
It's a great way to put it.
That's all a book is a lottery ticket. And you're like, will the powers that be carry it into the current at the right moment for the zeitgeist? I don't know.
That's right. And will there be an opportunity for me? Like, I always refer to it as pizza, slices of pizza, no toppings. $2.50 per book. That's not even a topping. That's one cheese slice if you're lucky in New York, right? And it's not a gourmet slice because those are like $4. So
Yep.
you are actually making, for every book that you sell, you're making one, if you're lucky, one slice of pizza, no toppings. And then
that's only hardcover.
And that's only hardcover. Paperback is 8%.
Paperback is like a bad cup of coffee.
Exactly, right. It's like it's some, it's a bag of Doritos at the airport. Yep. I mean, and so, multiply that by, $2 per book times X amount, and you realize how many books you actually have to move. This is why people tell you that the advance you get is really probably all the money that you're going to get. That's so right. You have to measure success in so many other ways. You have to measure success. It has to be. And then you tell people this stuff and they'll look at you and they'll go, well, why would you ever write a book?
Right. Yeah.
Because the idea deserves it, because this is what we do.
Yep. And there is the joy of holding it for the first time. Just seeing this thing that was in your brain actually exist in the world, that has to be the value.
Well, that's right. And that's why I always tell people that the difference between us authors and those who have a book inside of them and just can't get it out, the difference is that we finished. That's it.
That's it. It's not like we're better at it. We just finished it.
We just finished it, and you saw it through, and you get to see it on the shelves, and there it is.
Yep. All right.
Congratulations, Kate Fagan.
Thank you.
Congratulations on Hoop Muses. The book came out yesterday, March 7th. And it is available where all books are sold, right? We've got, if you want to go corporate, you can do the Amazon Barnes and Noble thing, or you can go to IndieBound, which I'm sure Kate might prefer. I love the fact that my publisher always admonishes me whenever I do any book stuff, and you just mention Amazon or something, and they'll call you and they'll go, don't forget the independents. Don't forget IndieBound.
Right.
So always take care of your independent bookstores. And that is it for us for Meadowlarkers 70. We will see you next week. And congratulations once again on Hoop Muses, Kate Fagan.
Thanks, Howard.